organizing this gathering. I hope it will be fun for all of us over the next few days. Maria has sort of assigned me the task of saying, if we're talking about meaning in flux, what's the meaning that we're talking about? My granddaughter at the age of 5 asked me, when you say, what does this mean? What are you asking? And I started riffing on this. I said, well, what does mean? And my grandson, who was 3 at the time, said, it's when you take things away from your brother. So he appreciated it, the sense of meaning operationally. Anyway, so I think the predominant paradigm in semantics today comes out of the philosophical tradition. It's built around truth conditions. Though there's another trend that seems to be growing, which treats meaning as something like collocations in a corpus, which we'll discard that one right away. Meaning has got to be more than collocations of a word in a corpus. Anyway, I've taken a different tack over the last 35, 40 years that I call conceptual semantics, which is trying to situate meaning in the mind, along with grammar, of course. If we take grammar to be in the mind, meaning has to be there too. And my impression is that philosophers and formal semanticists apparently find this approach incomprehensible. And more surprising, a lot of generative grammarians find it incomprehensible too, I think because they want to preserve the preeminence of syntax, to derive everything from the syntax and the lexicon, which is not very interesting. So today I want to just give you the flavor of the approach and give you some hints about some of the interesting results that I've arrived at. So the sort of problem I like to work on is illustrated on the handout. Does everybody have a handout? Yeah, we're good. So the question is, what's an end? What kinds of things have ends, and why do we attribute ends to them? So ropes have ends. Some tables have ends. That table has ends. This one does not. What? How come? Why should that be? Years have an end. Talks have an end. What's going on in the metaphysics that all these disparate things have ends? And the answer that I came up with is the basic case of an end is you take a line, a one-dimensional object, and the end is the boundary of that line. And now you can schematize various other kinds of entities as one-dimensional, as extended in space linearly, or extended in time linearly. So you can see a 2- or a 3-dimensional object conceptualized as a linear axis that's elaborated by a cross-section. So an H-beam is a line with a cross-section of an H shape that's passed along that entire line, or a tube, or a piece of macaroni, if you like, is a line, a curved line, this time with an annulus as its cross-section, stretched across the whole length of the line. Okay? A rectangular table like that one can be seen as linear, going this way, and the cross-section is the width of the top and the legs and so forth. But a square table doesn't readily lend itself to being conceptualized as a line. And now we can say the end of a 2-dimensional or a 3-dimensional object is a piece of the cross-section that elaborates the end of the line, of the linear axis, okay? So that the end of an H-beam is an H-shaped part of its surface. Now, that's good for a start. We say point to the end of the beam, you point to that part of the surface. But suppose you cut off the end of a rope. What are you doing? You can't cut off the boundary. You have to cut off the boundary plus some little piece of the body of the rope. So what we want to say, and that's cutting off the end of the rope, so the end of the rope can be thought of as the boundary of the linear axis, plus some extension that I'll call epsilon, whose size is pragmatically determined. I suppose the end of a 100-foot rope might include 5 feet, but the end of a 5-foot rope is going to be a couple of inches, something like that, right? So the epsilon is determined sort of pragmatically in context-dependent way. And now the end of the rope is that bit of the axis all expanded by the cross-section. So we end up with a hunk of rope. And the border of a rug, optionally includes the epsilon, but something like a border of a rug is a piece of the boundary of the rug extended into the body of the rug by some epsilon again. And there the epsilon is obligatory, although its extent is sort of determined, still determined conceptually. The crust of a loaf of bread is a piece of is the surface of the bread plus some amount epsilon into the body of the bread. So crust also has this property of needing this epsilon. So that's how end applies to spatial objects. How about to temporal objects, entities, whatever you want to call them? Well, there's this interesting puzzle that has been lying around in the literature for a while that's sometimes called the imperfective paradox. So if you say, he's now ending his speech, that's kind of, it looks paradoxical because ending, the end should be the boundary, the point when it stops, but the progressive aspect says there's a process going on over a period of time. Well, so how can you be ending if the end is just the boundary, the end point in time? Well, this epsilon explains it, because we can say the end of a speech is not just the final boundary, but the final boundary plus some distance backward into the speech towards the front. We don't know exactly when the end is beginning, but it's an interval of, we now have an interval of time. And the progressive now can apply inside that interval. So what we see is that, speaking of spatial and temporal properties in the same breath, cutting across between them is helping us explain some things. So now let's step back and see what this is saying. First of all, what does spatial extent have to do with temporal extent? You might say it's metaphor. Lakoff would certainly say it's metaphor. Time is conceptualized as space. But if it's conceptualized as space, how come it's one-dimensional? That's not explained by saying, why isn't there three-dimensional time? Time has its own properties, but one of them is it's inherently one-dimensional. The next question is, how can we treat a three-dimensional object like that table as one-dimensional? How can you tell which ones are really one-dimensional, like that one, and which ones are not, like this one? What we've explained the word end in terms of axes and cross-sections. In what sense is an axis of the table real? Such that it can have a truth value, that there could be a truth about the axis of the table. And the same with the cross-sections. And finally, what is this epsilon that seems to be pragmatically applied? What's the truth about how long it can be? Now, all of this makes sense if we're thinking not in terms of the truth about tables and about ends, but in terms of the way we conceptualize the world, the way we conceptualize tables and ends and ropes and so forth. It's we who abstract dimensionality and axes from spatial objects and events and times and so forth. We're the ones who make pragmatically appropriate extensions to a boundary along a linear axis. It's in the head, it's not in the world. Or it's in the world because it's in the head. That's a different way of thinking of it. If you take a perception course, they always stress, we make the world out there. So this leads to a theory of meaning, conceptual semantics, which is a theory of what humans can think about such that they can talk about it. So the entities that are in the world as we understand it. And this includes not just physical objects and their parts like ends, but also events and times, and also abstractions like PhD degrees. What kind of a thing is that? Or marriages, or if you're a baseball person, balls and strikes. What's a strike? Right? It's what you get 3 of and you're out. And what's an out? You know, those are all conceptually constructed, but there's a truth about balls and strikes, you know, that's created by the umpire. And we also have to be able to talk about theoretical entities like phlogiston, which turns out not to exist, but there was a time when people talked about it, so that was real stuff. Putnam's famous XYZ, that's water on some other planet. Quarks, which we do believe exist. They have the same status in semantics as phlogiston, right? Fictional or legendary characters like Sherlock Holmes and the devil, and then more abstractions like beauty and virtue and truth. It's very important to say truth goes in here because truth is just another word, like table, okay? It's a predicate over sentences. What are sentences? Well, if we are mentalist linguists, we say sentences are things in the head. So truth is about things in the head too. So this is about not how language works, but how people work such that they use language. So we're seeing semantics especially as a branch of cognitive science. So it's a theory of the information in a language user's brain that's involved in understanding utterances and connecting them to perceptual evidence, making inferences, making judgments of truth. So we want to recast the issues of truth conditional semantics in terms of mentalistic truth. Under what are the conditions that lead someone to judge a sentence true or false? Now, one of the things that immediately becomes interesting then is that a lot of semantics doesn't have anything to do with language. So it has to do with language per se, that is. So think about naive physics, or, you know, what do they call it? Theory of physics.
Folk.
Yeah, folk physics, right, thank you. It's not just people who have a folk physics, right? I mean, if you look at what animals do, they have a folk physics too, especially primates. So we want to say there's an innate basis of concepts that play a role in learning word meanings. Namely, you have to be able to generate the concept before you can attach it to a word. And there's some evidence from acquisition that says children need to have a concept before they can properly acquire a word for it. And so this relates to Liz Spelke's work on what she calls core domains of knowledge, things like space and objects and navigation and analog, magnitude and number. And most recently she's been talking about social cognition, and it so happens that I've thought about it too. What's interesting is that other primates share with us not only behavior that looks like they understand things about space, they also have very rich social cognition, and a lot of it looks damn familiar. So that suggests that there is, to some degree, an innate basis for our social cognition as well as our spatial cognition. And social cognition is quite abstract. So one of the fundamental claims, going back to the dispute with the generative grammarians, I suppose, is that the mind involves multiple sources of combinatoriality. Recursion is not restricted to language, it's all over the brain. And the combinatoriality of non-linguistic concepts is, we find in all these different domains. I would venture to say language is combinatorial because it needs to express combinatorial concepts. So the recursion in language is, in a way, parasitic on the recursion of meaning. And just a side point to say that when Chomsky, among other people, says the conceptual intentional interface arises through syntax, that's in effect saying babies and apes can't think, which is clearly wrong. So I don't know why this dogma holds on. Nevertheless, there we have it. I won't. So what I've ended up with is a view that says semantics has its own combinatorial properties, syntax has its own combinatorial properties, phonology, as we've known now for 40 years, has its own combinatorial properties. And a sentence is a well-formed triple of these structures with links among them saying how you get from one to the other. So a word is part of the interface among the three structures. It says, if you get such and such phonology, you're entitled to infer such and such semantics and such and such syntactic properties. That's how you comprehend language. You map from phonology to meaning via syntax. And if you're producing language, you are starting with a meaning you intend to express, map that into syntax and phonology, and then output it. So the grammar is inherently non-directional. That isn't as though you're starting with syntax and then deriving everything from it. So that's the overall picture of where conceptual semantics goes. Now I want to situate it a little further in the rest of the mind. So an interesting problem that was pointed out by John McNamara, and also in great detail by Miller and Johnson Laird in their 1976 book, Language and Perception, is there's this question of how do we talk about what we see. It can't be that we're just mapping from phonology to meanings. We have to get somehow to the perceptual system. So we'd like to say there is some level of, let's say, visual representation that maps into some level, presumably meaning, of linguistic representation. And we have this, and so in the parallel architecture framework, that amounts to saying there is this level of representation that's visual, some level of visual structure, and there's an interface between that and meaning, conceptual structure, that's not unlike the one between conceptual structure and syntax or syntax and phonology. And the hypothesis that grows, if you think about it a little bit, it's this level of visual representation has to be sort of quasi-geometric or topological. So I call it spatial structure. And for a first approximation, you can think of it as the highest level of the visual system, the point where we achieve understanding, not just perception, but understanding of the visually inspired environment. So objects at this level are probably represented in terms of detailed shape, but notice, and here's where you know, if you study perception at all, you immediately recognize this. There's this problem in perception of object constancy, that you identify something as the same object, see it as the same object no matter what angle, what lighting conditions, how far away from you it is, and so forth. And when we talk about a cat, let's say, we don't care where it is and what angle I'm seeing it from and so forth. So we would like it not to be the level from which you actually perceive the world, which is aspect dependent. We want to go beyond that and say there's spatial understanding, which is aspect independent, and says there is this spatial layout. We want it to be able to be schematic. So if we're talking about the action of sitting, we don't want it to be specifically Joe sitting or Fred sitting or Susie sitting. We want it to be some sort of an abstract schema that represents any human being sitting. So it has variables or something in it. It's not exclusively visual, because I can tell about the shape of objects not by looking at them but by feeling them. And I'd be surprised if I looked at it and it turned out to be a different shape from what the shape I felt. So we want this level of representation to encompass haptic perception, touch, perception by touch, as well as visual perception, and even proprioceptive perception. So one of the things you got to know is where your arms are, right? And that's there's whole collections of sensory systems in the joints and the muscles and so forth, which we won't go into. But the proprioceptive system has to be involved in reaching and picking things up and knowing whether you're doing it successfully. So this level is a big mystery, I think, but we can see what some of its properties are. What in particular, it looks like it's not modality specific because it extends across vision, hapsis, and proprioception. But it's coding what we know about the physical world. Now, conceptual structure, as it's been developed at least and just about every theory of semantics, is kind of algebraic. It's built up from discrete features and functions. That's quite different from something that's geometric or topological. So what are we doing with these two levels that are talking to each other? Well, they both talk about objects, but in quite different terms, right? So, for example, conceptual structure is really terrible at things like exact shapes. So how do you tell a duck from a goose? If you try to do it in terms of features, you end up with things like plus or minus long neck, right? And those things turned up in the early literature and linguistic semantics. That's terrible. But if we have spatial structure at our disposal, which is precisely trying to characterize shapes, we can offload the work of distinguishing ducks from geese onto spatial structure and not have these horrible features in conceptual structure. On the other hand, there are lots of things that we need in linguistic semantics, in conceptual structure, that can't be done spatially. So, for example, the type-token distinction. What's the difference in the representation of this fork, this particular fork, and any fork that looks exactly like it? They're going to be exactly the same representation, except we can say in conceptual structure, one is this fork, it's a particular one, versus a feature that says it's a type of fork rather than a token. The fact that something is an instance or a subtype of something else doesn't necessarily have to do with its appearance. Temporal relations, talking about things in the future and past, has nothing to do with the way they look. Causal relations, there's this argument goes back to, I believe, Hume. It says you can, all you can perceive, I'm right, I got the right guy, thank you. It says you can't just, all you can see is this object comes in and then that one starts moving. But you infer that that's causation. So causation is an inference. It can't be represented in how things look, but it's something that you extract from how things look. Things like hypothetical, non-specific, potential, fictional, are not features that can be expressed in terms of what things look like. And social notions, names, social domination, kinship terms, group membership, ownership, obligations, values, morality, these kinds of things have nothing to do with how things look. So these have to be coded in some corner of conceptual structure as well. And of course, theory of mind notions, so belief, imagination, intention, and commitment, and so forth, also are much better done in algebraic sort of feature and function argument sort of format. So we end up with an overall architecture for the mind, or at least significant parts of it, by putting phonology and syntax in a train of representations that leads to auditory signals coming in and motor instruction, vocal tract instructions in particular going out. Conceptual structure talks to spatial structure, other representations that have to do with sounds and tastes and stuff like that. And spatial structure branches into all these different modalities that it talks to. That also constitutes evidence for the parallel architecture view of language itself. Instead of deriving everything from syntax, there are these levels that are related to each other. You cannot extend the standard model of linguistics where things are derived from syntax to the connection with spatial structure. You can't derive spatial structure from syntax, for God's sake. right? That would imply that non-linguistic organisms couldn't understand the world visually. That would be nuts, right? So, but if we say they're related by interfaces that connect one kind of information to another, then language is of a piece with the rest of the mind. And that makes a lot more sense to me, if you care about such things. A lot of linguists don't care about how language fits into the rest of the mind. I think it's essential. So what counts as semantics now? There's this traditional division into semantics, which is what you derive from the words and the syntactic structure, and pragmatics, which is everything else. I would like to put it in a somewhat different way to say what we're calling pragmatics is any part of meaning that is not derived from the words and the syntactic structure. So it's a catch-all category for implicature, deixis, which we'll see in a minute, and a bunch of other things, perception, inference, world knowledge, all those things, which are all called pragmatics, but they're not a natural class. It's just a heterogeneous collection. So, question is, what if there is this conceptual structure, what is it built out of? What kinds of entities do we put in the world? Do we construct the world as though it has? Traditional philosophy of language and formal semantics has taken the view we want to cut down the number of basic entities to a bare minimum. If we can get away with just individuals and truth values, that's great, and we're going to do that as long as we can. Well, about 40 years ago, Davidson said maybe there's an event variable too, and people grudgingly accepted that, and that's now part of the armamentarium. But conceptual semantics says this is an empirical question, not just a matter of formal parsimony. The ontology has to come from the human conceptualization of the world, and it has to come through what organisms need to get through life. What may be elegant formally may not be elegant in terms of the brain. Let's see how what spatial understanding can tell us about the ontology. So take a sentence where we say, please pick that up. How do you interpret that, the word that in there? You have to use visual information, which you might call pragmatics, but if you say, what's the mechanism of it, you have to use the visual system to pick out an object that is projected as at the end of that pointing, right? So you're picking out an object in the world that is referential, but the actual reference is picked out visually. Well, if you think about it, there are all kinds of deictic pronouns, like deictic pro, whatever they are, that work like that, but don't refer to objects. So if I say, please put your hat there and your coat there, what am I pointing to? I'm not pointing to the table, I'm not designating the table, I'm designating the location, which happens to be on top of the table. The answer, where should I put my coat? On the table. So a place is something I can point to. We can say he went that way, where we're pointing to a trajectory or a path, something like that. We can say, please don't do that around here anymore. Do that. What am I picking out? I'm picking out an action, right? Did you hear that? Or I'm picking out a sound from the environment, and I might point to the source of the sound, something like that. I hope that doesn't happen again. Well, what kinds of things can happen? Not objects, but events, right? The fish I caught was this long. Now what I'm not picking out my hands, I'm picking out the distance between my hands. So you're picking a distance out of the visual field, using it to understand the sentence. Or there are about this many people at my talk last week too, okay? I'm picking out a numerosity or some sort of analog amount. Or can you walk like this? Now the pronoun is picking out a manner of movement. These are all potential referential terms. It's not just individuals and events and truth values. Okay, there's this huge range of different things that we can refer to as though they are real things in the world. And each one of them has its own conditions of individuation, and many of them have type token distinctions, and we can quantify over them. So we can say, anything you can do, I can do better, right? Where we're quantifying over actions. And that's just the ones you can perceive visually. In addition, there are things like information, so the complement of a verb of saying or telling is an ontological type. There are values and probably many others. So now let's look at word meanings for a while within this context. The standard approach to a word meaning is to say something like the meaning of cat is either it's just an undigested monad, that's Jerry Fodor's idea, or it's some formal expression like lambda x cat of x, something like that. Basically, it's saying cat has no decompositional structure, it's just a lump of meaning. But using the usual arguments that we use for grammar, we can see that there has to be combinatoriality in word meanings too. For one thing, you can basically find an unlimited number of words, of word meanings in the languages of the world. It has to be learnable. That means you have to build it from something. You can't just say, well, they're all in there, like Jerry says. And you're triggering each one. What are the conditions for triggering? And if it's an infinite number of possible word meanings, of course, you can't store them all in your head. And we see semantic relations among morphologically related words that suggest, again, that the combinatoriality of morphology is mimicking the combinatoriality of meaning. And words have common patterns of inference and so forth. Even so, the word meanings are not what philosophers have been looking for as word meanings. The standard story, again, is a word meaning is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So the meaning of cat is whatever necessary and sufficient conditions you need to pick out cats. That's the meaning. Well, that doesn't work. And it's been well known for a long time, although it's sort of pushed under the rug or something. So if you think about competition at a boundary, so the boundary between red and orange, when does it stop being red and start being orange as you move along that border? Well, it turns out to be context dependent and dependent on individuals and dependent on what you've seen recently and how many reds you've seen and how many oranges. And it's completely crazy. Basically, there's competition at that boundary. There is no truth of the matter about where the boundary is. It's not like, as Hillary Putnam would say, we have to appeal to experts to tell us where the boundary is, or we have to await an appropriate science of red and orange. The appropriate science of red and orange says it's continuous. There is no boundary. So what do? There's no fact of the matter. And another old case is how many hairs you have to have before you're not bald anymore. Tell me what the boundary is. What are the necessary and sufficient? It doesn't work, right? And it's the same problem we hit with our epsilon and n. So we have these cases where there's no strict boundary between two words that are kind of sisters semantically. Another kind of issue comes up with what I call preference rule conditions. So if you take the verb climb, if you say he climbed the tree, something, it looks like you have conditions about going upward towards the top of the tree and using some sort of a clambering motion, using your arms and legs with some sort of effort. Say, okay, those are the conditions, but then how can you climb down a tree? Oh, maybe going up isn't really a necessary condition. Okay, what about the airplane climbed into the clouds? Oh, it's not clambering, it's just going up. So we have to drop going up as a condition. What's left? Nothing. except it's an activity. Well, that doesn't distinguish it from anything else, right? From running and walking and eating and sleeping, everything. So but what you find is if you put both of those counterexamples together, you get something that doesn't work. The airplane climbed down out of the clouds really sounds weird. So what you want to say is that both these conditions are good. Either one is sufficient alone. If you have both of them, you get the stereotypical climbing, like climbing a tree. And you might say, well, that's pretty weird. How can we have conditions like that? They just don't make sense formally. Well, if you start looking at perception, if you start looking at phonetics, you find these kinds of things all over the place. They are typical of cognition in general. So we should not be suspicious of them in doing linguistic semantics. We should embrace them. Also, we should notice that word meanings can contain pieces of spatial structure. So there's often here and there talk about, let's say, part of the meaning of the word cat is an image of a stereotypical instance. And that's not something that's done in sort of formal function argument terms. Well, that's our spatial structure. That's the work that spatial structure is supposed to do. So we have to say what a dog looks like is part of the meaning, can be part of the meaning of dog, in addition to what it sounds like, what noises it makes, its behavior, its personality, all those things. We want to be able to include those. But even getting spatial structure in, again with ducks and geese, for example, it takes care of a lot of the stuff that is just garbage in conceptual structure terms. Another elaboration of word meanings is what James Pustiowski calls dot objects. So if you take a sentence like, the book that Bill gave me has a sad ending. Well, a book belongs to two ontological types. On one hand, it's a physical object, and Bill gave me that physical object. I can do anything with a book that I can do with a rock, pretty much. Hit you over the head with it, you know, use it as a doorstop and things like that. But what makes it a book is that it has information in it. So it lives in these two domains at once, the information domain, and the end of the book has to do with the end of the path through that information. It doesn't have to do with the end of the book. The physical end of the book, it would normally be the top or the bottom, I guess. I don't know. But we can put these in a preference rule relationship too. So we can have a blank book, a notebook that you buy at the drugstore, doesn't have any information in it at all. We have things that are only information, like e-books, or the book that I'm writing now, which is just a bunch of bits in my laptop. So we don't need both of those things. Either one will do if it satisfies the condition, but a stereotypical book has both. Maybe that's changing with the e-books around now, I don't know. And that means that reading is a dot activity because you're scanning this physical object with your eyes and you're getting information from it. Another one, a baseball thing again, is flying out to center field where there's a physical action, the batter hits the ball flies out towards center field, somebody catches it before it bounces. But what else? Well, there's the abstract action in what you might call the game frame, namely it says the batter is out, if that happens. Okay, what's an out? There are 3 of them, the inning is over, right? So that's in some other domain. Very important dot object is a human being. Which I think is a dot object consisting of the physical body and what every culture calls the mind or the spirit or the soul or something like that. In the physical domain, human beings have faces and hands and livers and toenails and stuff like that. In the social domain, that's where we apply theory of mind, where you can have obligations towards people but not towards tables. owners, moral responsibilities. And again, there's some sort of a preferential relationship going on. So what's a body without a spirit? It's a zombie maybe, or a corpse. Although corpses still keep a little of the person there, right? Why do you care about where they're buried and all that kind of stuff? The ghost is a mind or a soul without a body. And then there are all these cases where you dissociate the mind or the soul or the spirit from the body, and you have reincarnation and body switching and all that kind of junk. Also, multiple personality disorder, which is conceptualized as two people inhabiting the same body in competition. Right? And this is extremely powerful. We cannot avoid it. And this is what makes people resist cognitive science or neuroscience views of the mind that say, all you are is a brain, right? Say, where's my person? Where's my identity? It goes with the social part. You're saying that doesn't exist. And the resistance to evolution, again, comes from I think, the same source. The final question is, are scientific theories dot objects, where the observations are one domain and the theory is another? Well, let's see, where shall we go next, given that I have 5 minutes? Let's go to the middle of, to the top of page 8 on the handout. So let me talk a little bit about enriched composition. So the question is, how are utterance meanings built up from word meanings? Again, the classical formal semantics and traditional generative grammar derive all utterance meanings from syntax, and then maybe you apply pragmatics later. Okay? It seems like there are many aspects of meaning that aren't supported by syntactic or lexical expressions. So familiar ones like implicature. So if my wife says to me, are you going to be going near a mailbox? What does she mean? She means, would you mail some letters for me? Right? Ellipsis is more complicated. So here's the lyrics of a Rodgers and Hart song from the 1930s. It seems we stood and talked like this before. We looked at each other in the same way then, but I can't remember where or when. Where or when what? Try to find a syntactic structure that gives you the understanding of that sentence. I can't remember where or when we stood and talked like this before and looked at each other in the way we're looking at each other now. You're not going to have a rule that deletes all that stuff, right? Rather, you want to say the utterance meaning is constructed from your understanding of this multi-sentential context. On the other hand, we have cases where there's no sentential context whatsoever, such as in this cartoon where the lady says, don't, and we know exactly what she means. It's not clear exactly what words you would put in. There are many, many, many choices. Rather, we want to say those words are reflections of your understanding of the situation. More integrated into the form of the sentences are things like constructional meaning. So if you have something like the trolley rumbled around the corner, there's a sense of the trolley being in motion and going around the corner, rumbling. There's no word go in there. It comes from a construction that says you're allowed to put in a sound emission verb in a motion context, meaning it produced this sound as it was traversing this path. And then the familiar examples like the ham sandwich in the corner wants more coffee, where the ham sandwich cannot be derived from the guy with the ham sandwich, probably. Or Plato is on the top shelf. And right next to Chomsky, which has to mean a book by him or a bust of him or something like that. So the idea is that syntax and semantics are not in lockstep. From the meaning point of view, these are things that you don't have to say because you've conventionalized these forms of ellipsis or implicature or whatever. Looking from the syntax point of view, there's a lot more to meaning than is being expressed directly by the sentence. So I guess I'll sum up here. what we've got is a theory that is thoroughly conceptualist, grounded in, to the extent that we can, it's grounded in aspects of cognition that don't have anything to do necessarily with language. And language is just there to express these things. The combinatoriality is not derived from syntax. Rather, syntax is running in parallel with the combinatoriality meaning in such a way as to express it. And mostly they line up, but if we look closely, there are lots of cases where they don't line up. So there's this many-to-many relationship between syntax and semantics. And the challenge, of course, is how can you do it all? That's a, you know, and to keep your eye on the large picture and not just get stuck in some little corner. And every corner is going to be interesting, but we're dealing with fractals here. Every piece is as complicated as what this is a piece of. I guess that's where I'll stop. Thank you.